So let's move back to the Fertile Crescent from the Mediterranean Sea and start speaking about the Assyrians. So the Assyrians emerge around the year circa 1300 BCE. Okay, so that's about 3,320 years ago from today. They took control of Mesopotamia in the year 1200 BCE, so about after 100 years of first emerging on their own, they kind of take over fully all of Mesopotamia. They then start moving on to start conquering other areas in the Fertile Crescent, such as Canaan, Phoenicia, which is the Phoenicians that we just spoke about on the coast right here of Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre. They took over those areas. They also start taking over Israel, the rest of Israel, because that was mostly in that same area of Phoenicia. And then they even take over Egypt. In all of those cases, they did that in about the area of the years from 800 to 600 BCE, so about 400 years after taking over Mesopotamia. And so it's quite this kind of big expanse they start taking over. And at that time, they were the largest world empire to date. Okay, the largest world empire to date. And you can see actually a picture of them right here. This is kind of where they started with Mesopotamia. And then they kind of took over that area. Then they started taking over Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre of the Phoenicians, further moving south into the area of Israel, then Egypt. And so this is the entire expanse of the Assyrian Empire by around 800 to 600 BCE. And when they were taking over these areas of Canaan, Phoenicia, Israel, and Egypt, they actually relocated the people. And we'll talk about that in a moment. They're again the largest world empire to this time, okay, bigger than any of the other ones that we've talked about, such as the Hittites and the Egyptians, because again they owned everything that the Hittites owned, and they owned also almost everything that the Egyptians owned when they took over the Egyptians. And so, huge area of land for that time. However, that would eventually be eclipsed by future empires that we'll get to in this course. They used caravan routes to control and supply their empire. Okay, these caravan routes, basically roads or routes that caravans would go across the desert, and caravans as in people with horses or camels in this case, with packs of gear on them. Sometimes they would walk themselves and drag sometimes carts or whatever like that, or wagons on these caravan routes. And they would go from place to place to place, spreading their supplies throughout the area. They also ruled through provincial governors as in governors of certain areas. So they would divide the areas up into small areas, the whole kingdom up into small areas, and a governor would maybe rule this area, and another one this area, and another one that area, etc. And so that became quite important for them, how to rule that such a large area easily. The governors did like the day-to-day ruling. They also communicated via Pony Express. That's a term that we've kind of come up with here in America, as well as other countries, for a modern day kind of mail system and messenger system, using horses to deliver the messages, with riders, of course. And what would end up happening is you would again have, say, if news had to get from here all the way over to here, you would end up having a person ride on a horse from here to here. And they would maybe be able to do that in a day or half a day. But of course, the horse would get, of course, tired. It's doing the most of the work and the speed. And so they would swap horses. And they would swap horses and ride from another one to another place, all the way down to here. Sometimes maybe there was civilizations or whatever in the desert, but unlikely at that time. Okay, so they would have gone following along the Fertile Crescent, right? And so they would have traveled from one place to another, swapping horses, and sometimes even swapping messengers or riders themselves, and just handing off the message to person to person. eventually reaching the destination. And they would do that also to correspond with their king, their leaders, and the governors would have them throughout their own little territories as well, making sure that news would get to them within only a couple days, if not maybe a week at most, from one side of the empire to the other, which is quite ingenious. This is the Pony Express. And of course it's named kind of the same idea based on what we had early for mail system in America. But moving on to the Assyrians. The Aramaic language was the language that they spoke, okay? An Aramaic language. Aramaic was very similar to later Hebrew, okay? In fact, actually, the idea today is that Jesus, during the period of Jesus in Israel and in Jerusalem, he and everybody else would have been speaking Aramaic. Rather than Hebrew. Hebrew kind of developed afterwards, as well as at the same time, but they were kind of it was developing into that language of Hebrew. So it's very similar to Hebrew, but Aramaic was the main language of the Assyrians, and later on in that area as well. Just even though it was 600 plus years later. Moving on, the Assyrians were one of those iron-using civilizations. We talked about iron very briefly last time, that several civilizations tried to use it, but they really couldn't use it because the amount of heat required from the fire to melt iron and iron ore into being able to be used. But the Assyrians finally had unlocked that idea of how to make their ovens and their forges hot enough to start melting the iron. And so they used iron on a massive scale. So now we're kind of emerging out of the Bronze Age into the Iron Age, unofficially, if not kind of fully officially in some places. They had a very large military, obviously, to take over this entire area. They would have had a very large military, especially to be able to take over the Egyptians, right? And as well as the Hittites, and others. Or not the Hittites, but the people that came after the Hittites, the Phoenicians, etc. And so this military also had a very big religious ethic, okay? It was very based on their religion. The army belonged in their minds to their god Assur, okay? Assur. And he was one of their major gods, which was why they were the Assyrians. And they actually, when they conquered people, they forced the people they conquered to then swap religions to worship Assur, against their wills most of the time. They had a professional army, unlike previous, where it was kind of maybe volunteers for some countries and places. But definitely this kingdom had a fully professional army, having soldiers that were infantry, meaning that they were walk around on foot and fight on foot, to cavalry, riding horses, okay, or camels, as well as chariot riders, riding on the backs of two-wheeled chariots. They also used siege weapons, such as battering rams, which you could probably just take a log or something like that, maybe put on iron or bronze on the tip of the log, and have a bunch of people carrying it, and use it to ram down the gate of a city or a town. And that was necessary when they were taking over all of these areas, because people would retreat to their city in their city walls. And so they were able to do that. They also had siege towers, which were big, giant contraptions, kind of like a tower, but on wheels. Okay, a wooden tower on wheels pushed up against the side of the wall of a city. You've probably seen that in movies. But they developed the idea of battering rams and siege towers, or at least used them heavily, if not the first people to use them. There were probably others that used them first. They also ruled their land through fear, torture, and selective depopulation through relocation. We already mentioned this relocation, and we're going back to that. So, fear. Obviously, scare the people into obeying you. Torture. Obviously, torture them into obeying you at times. If people were to act out, or prisoners, or whatever, you would torture them. Sometimes torture them to the death. And it would get the point across to everybody else, better listen, or we'll do the same thing to you, incredible amount of pain before you die, kind of thing. And then finally, the last is selective depopulation through relocation. Which means what? Well, say they conquer the area of Egypt, and they decide that the Egyptian people keep on wanting to rebel and wanting to fight against the Assyrian rule. Well, let's just move them. Let's move them to no longer being in the place that they are anymore, and let's move them here. And originally the Mesopotamians might have been moved all around as well. The people of Phoenicia, they would have been possibly moved to different areas as well as the Israelites, etc. And so you end up having this happen where the people are moved from one place to another, where they're not used to where they are living now. They are not kind of in this idea of, okay, well, I'm going to fight for my land because this is my area, this is where I've grown up on, I know the area well to fight from it, as well as being able to have this pride of area where you're living. And so this kind of selective depopulation through relocation worked really well for the Assyrians, if not a terrible, horrible practice when happening to people, right? And so they defeated the Israelites, remember, after we said on here, against Israel. And they did so by defeating the siege of Samaria, okay? There was the city of Samaria where many of the Israelites were living in present-day Israel, right around here. And actually, it's right there on the map. You can see it right there. And so Samaria, after this 3-long-year siege where they were in the city walls of Samaria, battering rams and siege towers were used by the Assyrian army to conquer the Israelites. Immediately afterwards, all the inhabitants of the Israelites living there were exiled to elsewhere. They were sent through that selective depopulation, through relocation, throughout all over. And in fact, they were split into about 10 different groups. And this becomes known in the Old Testament as well as in other places about the history of the lost tribes of Israel. Okay, and so moving on, we've got the map, which we've already talked about. And so, as you can see, this and this, same area, right? That this is the Fertile Crescent. And this period is still going to be most of the major empires are originating out of this area. Okay? And again, the Phoenicians were right here. We've talked about that. The Egyptians not too far away. Crete, right here for the Minoans. The Mycenaeans that we'll talk about in the video on Lecture 5 were in this area. The Sea Peoples attacking all of this area as well. And so it's always these areas this is the first area of civilization, the first major area of civilization, and it's beginning to spread out, as you can see. Okay. The peak and downfall of Assyria, eventually after conquering all of this area, right here, and all of this area that you see in this map of the green area. Eventually, by about 705, they've reached their peak, and by about 560, it begins where they start falling, where they start shrinking in size. And why does this happen? Well, it first starts with a revolt in Babylon, okay, where Sennacherib, the last king of the Assyrians, decides that he is going to destroy the city of Babylon. Okay? Babylon right there. The city of Babylon in Mesopotamia, which we spoke about earlier when talking about the Fertile Crescent in Babylon, when it was built first. Well, he destroys it. Okay? He destroys the city. On that position where Babylon was, he decides to rebuild a city in just full Assyrian idea, okay, that only loyal Assyrians can live in. And so this area is built, and it is known as the city of Nineveh, okay, on the exact same spot, built on the city to replace the old city of Babylon. It's a major city, this massive, massive city. It has a 7.5-mile circumference, meaning it's in circular size, 7.5 miles wide, or size, round, not wide. It's one of the largest ever cities built in the ancient world. And at that time, I think it was even bigger than even the largest Egyptian ones. It had a giant palace built to Sennacherib, built for him, which had more than 80 rooms. While not quite as big as the one at Knossos, it's still pretty big. He also had exotic animals and gardens brought from all over this area, brought to Babylon, or this new city of Nineveh, former city of Babylon. And they were kind of like this kind of zoo for him and for the city itself. And in addition to this, Nineveh had a massive, massive library. One of the largest libraries at the time. Again, it would have been mostly clay tablets, maybe some papyrus as well from Egypt. But this allowed much of the ancient literature of the periods beforehand to survive, because this library would eventually spread out, give copies to other areas. It included 30,000 clay tablets, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we've spoken about before. So, well, Sennacherib had built his new city of Nineveh there, and he began to sack multiple cities in Judah, okay? Right here, Judah, this area right here. Sacking is a term that we will use multiple times in this course, and it means to loot, as in plunder, take things from people, to steal things from people, as well as also kill them, possibly even rape the people there as well. And so there's two versions of sacking a city. One is good sack, as it's kind of called by historians. Good sacking is where you don't end up killing the people if they run to churches. If they run to the church or the temple, they can escape you because you're the same religion as them, and you respect them if they understood that they went to their church, and you don't attack the church. The people that want to claim safe haven in the church or temple are safe because you are the same religion, and you respect that. The other version of sacking is bad sack, and bad sacking is you are a different religion than the people that you are attacking, and that if they go into their temple, you don't care if they went in their temple for safe haven, because their temple is just as fair game as anywhere else, because you don't respect their religion, okay? In this case, Sennacherib was probably bad sacking all of these areas in Judah. And so Sennacherib ordered the killing of people and torturing of people by the Assyrian army, and what this causes is not just the people of those cities that survive to want to rebel, but cities all over this region of Judah start rebelling, not just the one or two. And so this event is actually mentioned in the Bible, as well as tons of other documents that take place or that were written during this period. About 185,000 Assyrians from the Assyrian army of Sennacherib are said to have been struck down by Yahweh, the God, in this area. Now it is said that they were struck down by Yahweh in the Bible, as well as other events. But what really happened? Was it lightning striking them down or smiting them? No, they were probably killed in the rebellion, where the people of Judah, as well as this area in general, started revolting and killing them through combat and fighting. At this time also, we have the country of Lydia deciding to start over in Asia Minor, up in Asia Minor here, okay? Start forming on its own, and also start seizing that area of Asia Minor because of the areas here that were the Assyrians owned. Lydia kind of takes over that area. And so it weakens the Assyrians even more, little bit by little bit. And eventually, what ends up causing the real downfall of the Assyrians are the Chaldeans, which come in from the side and start attacking over here. And the Chaldeans are another kingdom at this time. In the year 612, the city of Nineveh is actually attacked and then sacked by the Chaldeans. Okay, this new kingdom that arrives on the scene. Not the green area, an area near the green area. And the Chaldeans at this point destroy the city of Nineveh. And they rebuild the city of Nineveh as Babylon. They rebuild the wreck of Nineveh into the city of Babylon. And they call it the New Babylon, the new city of Babylon. And because of this, in the period of the 560s after Nineveh was destroyed, the Chaldeans are completely victorious over the Assyrians, and the Assyrians go completely away and are defeated. And the Chaldeans take over all of the area, or begin to take over all of the area that the Assyrians controlled in the 560s. And as they do that, they are constantly rebuilding the city of Nineveh into their new Babylonian capital of Babylon. And they rename it Babylon. The Chaldeans then become known as the New Babylonian Empire because of this renaming of the city, because they become famous from it. This city is quite immense and has a population of 100,000 people, which is even bigger than the previous city of Nineveh. So it was 7.5 miles in circumference. It's possibly up to 8, or even just larger, even larger than that in size. But it's a massive population of 100,000 people, which was one of the biggest cities at this entire time in the entire world. And it became famous for a couple different archaeological, or not archaeological, but architectural creations that the Babylonians, or these new Babylonians, the Chaldeans, built. One being the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. It was one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. You may have heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon before in the past, and if not, that's okay. What they are is exactly in these pictures here. Now, these are, of course, computer-generated artistic pictures, because they do not last anymore. They have all been they have fallen down. But what they would have been a very large building on the bottom, and then plants around the edges. And then you would have had more plants on the roof, and then you would have had like an extra level that was slightly smaller with more plants and trees and gardens, and then an extra level above that with more. And they would have had constantly fountains, because they did have plumbing that would work up to about 1 or 2 stories, maybe even 3 stories at this time, where the water would carry water up to them, and that they would kind of have little waterfalls coming off the terraces, off the balconies. They would have vines and plants growing over the edges, as well as up the wall and down the wall, depending on what it was, like a tree kind of covering over the side of the wall. By being right next to it. And so you've got this idea where the gardens are kind of hanging off the sky, or hanging off these giant buildings. And so you end up having these terraces or porches and patios on these, levels, where it looks like the gardens are hanging over the edges. So quite interesting. We also have the Ishtar Gate built by the Chaldeans, which is right here, which is today in a museum. This beautiful Ishtar Gate, which is this beautiful blue painted tile on the side of the city wall. And this would have been around the entire city wall. Today, the Ishtar Gate survives, although the rest of the city wall does not. But it was preserved, and it is now in a museum, or a museum built over it. Also, the Chaldeans also begin the study of astronomy and astrology heavily during this period, which is quite interesting to some of you. Some of you may study the stars. Some of you may study your horoscopes and read your horoscopes daily or weekly or even just monthly. If so, that's fine. Who should you thank for that? The Chaldeans. They were the ones that came up with it. And so let's move on to talking about one of the first kings of the Chaldeans, actually specifically the second king of the Chaldeans, Nebuchadnezzar II. Okay? And so we'll talk about him in the next video.